Mr. Speaker, when we're saying that we're working in contexts where prostitution is illegal, there are three key characteristics that we need to look at. Firstly, we think that people in these areas who engage in the practice of prostitution do not go into the idea of prostitution because they want it, but moreover, they go in towards the idea of prostitution because of the factors in the environment force them to go into this practice of prostitution. We're talking about cases of human trafficking or extreme abject poverty that force them to go into the practice of prostitution without true consent. But secondly, we think there's a big distinction between legal prostitution and illegal prostitution, and that is the idea of state regulation, which enforces rules and solidifies consent for the people who engage in the idea of the practice of prostitution by making contracts, benefits, rights, and protections for these prostitutes in legal places. Thirdly and finally, we think that prostitution is created based on demand for the idea of prostitution. It's not created because of the number of promiscuous women out in the market, but moreover of the idea that men have a desire to buy as much prostitutes as possible, and they want to make sure that they can get those prostitutes. In this debate, what is the stance the side government has? Firstly, we want to drastically lessen the punishment that is placed on towards the prostitute and transfer that liability towards the brothels and the consumers of prostitution itself. Secondly, we're going to equate the punishment that the consumer gets as to that of rape and give them the exact same punishments that any rapist would get. Ideas of massive forms of jail time or massive forms of fines. And thirdly and finally, we're going to make sure that we continue our state efforts to solve the problem of prostitution by things such as making sure that we can rehabilitate those women who engage in the practice of prostitution, or also making sure that you can increase the job opportunities that these people can get. As Prime Minister, I have 2 points for you today. Firstly, I'm going to explain that consent is manufactured in this specific context of prostitution and why this manufactured consent equates to rape. And secondly, I'm going to explain how this policy solves the very roots of prostitution. Let's go to my first point. My first point is how consent is manufactured in the context of prostitution and why this equates to rape. First thing we need to ask in this debate, Mr. Speaker, is what is the definition of rape to begin with? We think that rape, as defined by the state, is an individual placing sexual advances towards another person without as much genuine consent as possible. And we think when it comes to adjudicating whether something is defined as a rape, there are two standards the state uses. Firstly, it looks into the idea it looks into the fact that the person did not have consent to begin with, like the idea of the person just simply being forced upon to have sex with that person. But secondly, another circumstance that state looks at when it comes to defining rape is the idea that the consent itself was completely manufactured. It recognized that some people may have had a small amount or a small degree of consent in this context, but these people did not have the proper mental capacity to make that decision properly or in the most rational way possible. An example I can give you is the idea of alcoholics. Like when people are drunk and they have sex, they might have had some small amount of consent, but once these people sober up and realize that they did get raped, they can call for it because of the fact that their mental capacity wasn't as genuine to begin with. No, thank you. So given this definition, why does the context of illegal prostitution actually equate to rape? Because let's apply the two standards that I told you, right? The idea that the person did not consent or the idea that the consent was manufactured. On both scenarios, we think that the idea that did not consent, in most of the contexts where prostitution is legalized, in the vast majority of cases, people are usually human trafficked when they go in towards the idea of prostitution. If we give you statistics, we think that 30% of the prostitutes that exist in Amsterdam right now actually come from human trafficking and from illegal sex trades to begin with. But even in areas like Vietnam or in Thailand, very often even the families themselves create their own children and bring them towards human trafficking centers to make sure that they can still get some amount of money for their family. This necessarily shows that in the vast majority of cases, the prostitutes in this area didn't necessarily consent to it. But secondly, even if this consent was actually manufactured, even in the best case scenario for opposition, we need to realize that the very environment they had of poverty forced them to actually go to this area, and they didn't necessarily have the proper mental capacity to make this decision. Because the very choice that a woman has, who has like 8 kids every day and tries to feed that woman, it's a choice of her having to sell her body or not being fed or making her children die as well. We think when it comes to alternative, she doesn't necessarily have much of an alternative except to sell her body at the end of the day. This necessarily shows that the woman has no mental capacity to properly adjudicate her decision when it comes to making the choice of prostitution. In that context, in the same way that we punish people who had sex when they were drunk, we think that the same thing can apply in this context. But what we need to look at and this is an important nuance, is the third question. But what is the particular distinction between ideas when prostitution is legal and when it is actually legal? Let's make a distinction between the two contexts. We think that when it comes to the idea of legal prostitution, we think that a particular nuance is the fact that it is state regulated. In the context of legal prostitution, information is given, rules are established, and contracts are given to make sure that some amount of consent can be solidified and established. We will concede that in some degree, some of these women might be influenced by the poverty that exists. But at the very least, when it is state regulated, make sure that you minimize harm, you can establish consent. Because for example, when in a legal system, if I ask for $1,000, I know that I can expect and demand $1,000 from the state. But in an illegal system where I am just faced with brothels, I might expect $1,000, but I might not necessarily consent to the massive forms of abuse that I'm experiencing, or I might not even get a proper pay as a prostitute. So the conclusion here is that we think that there's no legitimate institution in a context of illegal prostitution to properly monitor consent in these areas, because mostly these brothels can have the freedom to massively abuse these women at the end of the day. Let's go to my second point on how you prevent the root of prostitution. For that,
your first job is to first, even if consent exists, why do you have to punish those customers and them out being rapist?
Because we think the state itself has its own interest to make sure that you prevent the very root of prostitution at the end of the day, and prostitution itself is a crime in most of these areas where it's illegal anyway. This is so nice towards my second point, on how you solve the root of prostitution. What problem exists right now? We think that the very root of prostitution, which in a context where the state is illegal, when it's illegal, has an interest in preventing, is the idea of the massive demand that exists for prostitution. It doesn't exist because women are like, go sleep with me. It's more of the idea of a huge market demand of men to have prostitutes and because of their sexual desire. What happens but we think that in the current model of punishing the prostitute is extremely insufficient for solving the problem, because these brothels can still look for other prostitutes and men can still have another prostitute to look out for, and these brothels can still get profit and get even more women to traffic at the end of the day. So what happens in our model? What do you think is to target the ones that we need to target by preventing the demand from happening? Because when we actually punish the person who actually did consume the very product of prostitution, the prostitute, when you catch him, you create a massively effective deterrence. Because he's not put in jail, he's now goes through massive forms of fine, and you prevent him from ever going towards the practice of prostitution because of the massive deterrence you get when you are equated to a rapist. So what's the conclusion? We think in order for us to solve the very problem for prostitution, we must look towards the other side and look into the demand and target the people who are consuming prostitution the most. Ladies and gentlemen, if you truly want justice for these women, if you truly want to prevent the very pressing problem of prostitution, stand beside proposition. Thank you.
Side government's case only assume that the current system is not already punishing individuals. They have to prove to you from the get-go that why it's legitimate to punish an individual to laws that are tantamount to rape. That is what they had to do, but we think that they haven't do so. We have two principles from our side that we stand for. Firstly, that in this scenario, with prostitution being illegal, is known by every single party. And yet, when they choose to break the law, we tell you that it's still consensual between two sides. But secondly, that it harms and their policy harms and trivializes the significance of actual rape, in which they translate the harm to minorities who actually got raped. And we tell you that, moreover, check and balances within the system is enough as deterrence to those deterrence to rape and proportionate punishment. We tell that these kind of individuals still get charged, still get jailed, and still get public record for breaking those kind of laws. So we think that in status quo, that kind of punishment already happened itself. Before I move on into my substantive, which are revolve around these two principles, let's look at a few rebuttals. Firstly, they consider the fact that there are cases of human trafficking and pimps, all these kind of things. But that's incorrect, because firstly, the issues of pimps mostly happens in country that already legalizes prostitution. But secondly, even if they argue that no, this still happens in their context, without that they are not solving the problem at the root. Because the main cause of these kind of things are the leaders, the pimps that coerce them into those kind of acts itself. So they're not solving it at its root. Moreover, they told you about how consent is manufactured. Look, in current status quo, assuming that there's no consent in that sex itself, without that current status quo already charged that individual as rape. We tell you that their side never put any significance by telling you why even though there was consent, it is manufactured, like it still happens in status quo. Moreover, they told you about this idea about solving prostitution. Firstly, once again, they are not solving the problem at its root, because they already considered in their characterization about human trafficking and how they coerce this individual as a whole. We tell that you solve the problem by curbing the problem, which is like solving the problem of those pimps itself, not punishing individuals to go there. But secondly, they're shifting the fault to an individual that consent to that sexual act itself. So we think that they're shifting the burden here. Alright, into my two substantive. Firstly, why their policy causes disproportionate punishment to customers, and secondly, how their side trivializes the significance of actual rape. So firstly, why their side have disproportionate punishment to customers? Because we have to recognize that prostitutes are fully consensual to be a prostitute. We reject their kind of characterization they brought you. Because we tell them most of the time, even though when there's check and balances within the system, like you have social services to give these kind of individuals who are poor, in which they consider to that, they still take the easy way out, in which they become a prostitute. But even if they still want to argue that these kind of individuals are coerced into those kind of act, without that there's a huge amount of disproportionate harm to customers when they do so. Moreover, we tell that most of the time customers already opted in when it seemed reasonably consensual. Because we tell that the prostitution allows a guy to have sex with them. We tell that in most of the cases the prostitutes lure that individual in. But at that moment in time, we tell that the customers is not aware of the trivialization of the situation. Because it's deemed okay by the customers, because the prostitute already consent to having sex with this customer itself. We think that it was deemed okay in the first place. Moreover, we know that their policy is labeling individuals as rapists when it's completely undeserving. Because the prostitute, we have to understand that prostitute said that he's okay with that man having sex with them. We thought that you harm individuals when he is not a rapist. Even though he was engaged in consensual sex, he is forever labeled a rapist under your context. We thought that even though both parties agreed, he's still labeled as a rapist. That's extremely bad for an individual. Because consent already existed, you still label him as a rapist, which trivializes the entire judiciary system, which leads nicely to my second argument. Before that, yes. What?
In your model, is the customer punished?
Yeah, like in current status quo, like if you really want to talk about individuals who when you want to talk about the consent is manufactured, of course, if the prostitute declares in court that the consent was manufactured, that she did not fully consent to it, under status quo, they already charge you with rape, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that you're we don't think that your case stands. But secondly, on why their policy trivializes the significance of actual rape. Because let's understand, sit down, let's understand the nature of rape itself. That you force yourself upon another individual, and when one is raped, that victim is constantly struggling, which also means that there was no consent in that sexual act at all. What their policy does, it is harms individuals that actually got raped. Because we tell you that those that actually got raped would always be seen as prostitutes. Because let's again analyze the psyche of the victims, that they are already extremely emotionally harmed and scarred when they get raped. We tell you that they are further scarred under your policy if the loss of prostitution is tantamount to rape. We tell you that people will view that if you are raped, you are on the same level as prostitution. Because the person that rapes you, obviously he's charged with rape. But under their policy, the customers of prostitutes are also viewed as rapists. So you put individuals who are emotionally scarred and who are truly raped on the same level of prostitutes. That's extremely harmful. Moreover, we tell you that their policy trivializes the judiciary system regarding rape. Because by placing an actual rapist on the same level as a person who engaged in consensual sex, you demonize the people that engage in actual consensual sex. That's when you trivialize the judiciary system, because it's more likely that individuals like society detract people away from the law, and it starts questioning the consistency of the law. Why are you putting a person who engaged in consensual sex on the same level as a person who actually had the intention of raping that individual? People start questioning the legitimacy and consistency of the law under your side. It's extremely harmful. The conclusion to these arguments is simple: that we think that rape is something that affects all of society as a whole. We think that their policy takes away that significance away. Mr. Speaker, I've told you about how their policy causes disproportionate punishment, and we have clearly told you why rape is so important and why you cannot detract people away from what truly is the problem. For all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
There's a big thing that I need to clarify in my deputy speech as early as now. It's the thing that the previous speaker conceded. He conceded that apparently on our side we give 100% consent from a person or person in prostitution, because apparently it's always up to my decision at the end of the day. And he then conceded in the POI that if he does not consent, or if that she does not consent to that person, to that customer, it is rape. Well, that is what we're fighting for. We told you that consent isn't just about saying yes, but the influences of you saying that yes, or the influence you are in before you said that yes. That's why we give you the parallelism of drunk people. Even if they say yes verbally to the person they're gonna have sexual affairs with, you still consider that rape because they're under the influence of alcohol, and people took advantage of them, and that's why you consider that as rape. It's not as easy as just saying yes, and we do not question consent, or we do not base consent just on that idea of yes. And that's a big concession on their state that the next speaker has to fix. So I have an argument for you today, and it's about how the elevation of the status of crime creates a greater urgency and priority in relation to the issue. But before that, 4 points of rebuttal. The first idea is about consent. Because first of response, we told you extensively that the idea of consent, as I already mentioned, isn't just about you saying yes, but the influence you're in. It's about people actually taking advantage of you, or people taking advantage of the context that you're in, for example, the alcohol in your body, or all these other influences. We told you extensively in terms of other contexts, that in terms of being poor or being in these conditions, that you're unable to actually move out of it. That's why it's called a manufactured consent at the end of the day, because you're in the influences of poverty or the influences of these other things. But the main thing that they were unresponsive to, coming from my previous speaker, was a state mechanism where this already illegal places. We believe the problem on your side, why it's still considered as no consent, is because these people usually are under the usually do not have the ability to go to state for help, or do not have the ability to just regulate these things or the acts of prostitution. Oftentimes, they can't go to the state to tell them that you have to mandate a condom or all these other things, because the state won't go to you since it is legal. Oftentimes, these things are handled upon by brothels or by customers, that I'm going to buy this person for this position, I'm going to buy this person, even I want this person to not have I do not want to wear a condom while having sex with this person. These are things that necessarily disenfranchises people, because they do not consent to this. Usually it's up to the brothels to decide whatever the fate of the prostitute will be. The second level response, what is the actual punishment? Usually it's not just in the customers, or even if it's in the customers, usually these things are so minute to the customer, maybe it's just a fine or civil punishment. Usually the big punishments are targeted towards the brothels, or even just the prostitution in terms of rehab and whatnot. That's the actual repercussions or the reality of how prostitution and the actual crime punishment for prostitution. No, thank you, ma'am. So what we are doing on our side is we want to elevate the status not only to the brothels, but also to the part which is actually the root of the problem, which is that of the person actually demanding it. That's why they were unresponsive to my speaker, because we told you that the problem is not people, prostitutes wanting to have sex and all this stuff, but the people wanting to demand having that sex. That's why we want to solve the root of the problem and the system, so that people do not have to be forced to go into that system of prostitutions where people where customers are more likely wanting to go into that affair or wanting to take that supply or not. Second thing thing I want to rebut is the idea of disproportionate punishment, because they said apparently it's not the same punishment. This is where their concession was vital, because they said that even if people do not consent to this, then it's tantamount to rape. That's what we are saying. We're telling you that consent isn't just about the yes, but also the environment that the yes was placed in. But in the second level response, if they're talking about being labeled as a rapist, we believe firstly they deserve to be called rapists because of the taking advantage of the people. But second level, we believe this is a greater deterrence for them not to actually be involved in the illegal act of prostitution, because you might be labeled as something as a greater punishment and as a greater rapist or not. These are things that actually deter you from going to the problem or going to this act and whatnot. Third thing I want to respond to is the idea that the impact of rape label, apparently we're lessening the impact of rape label if we put prostitution here. On the first level, we believe no, because even if we have the idea of genocides, even if it's small murder, we still consider both as murder, and the impact will still be the same as a crime against punishment and a capital punishment at the end of the day. But on the second level response, it's not like people automatically, if they are subject to rape, will automatically relate that to prostitution, because there are different means to get the same punishment. If I get the punishment of theft, it's not because I do one reason, like stole a banana, but there are numerous ways to get that same punishment. It's not automatically associated with you being involved in prostitution, so we don't get the idea that it will automatically be associated to that. So at the end, they believe the entire case was unresponsive, and they believe that they were not necessarily looking about the harms that the previous speaker mentioned. First argument, how the elevation of the status of the crime creates a greater urgency and priority in relation to the issue. Because we need to allow prostitution for the customers. Usually, it's either one, customers get away with a crime because often it is targeted to brothels specifically, or secondly, minimal compensation, maybe civil offense, or maybe just fines, whatnot. What's the problem? We say the reason there's a lenient perception is because of the impact of the disincentive of the customers, that there's so much need for them to actually be disincentivized towards that actual product, whatnot. Usually, it's relatively small in terms of priority of the state, on how the state necessarily views that issue at the end of the day. What we are doing is we want to elevate the status of this crime and say that it is rape, it is a criminal and a capital punishment, and obviously it is a crime against humanity. There's a much greater label that creates a greater impact for states to view this thing or perceive this thing, and it has a greater impact of what that act actually means at the end of the day. Why? Because when you compare both sides, obviously when you have two different things as crime against humanity like murder as compared to a civil offense like theft, usually state's priority has to go to the thing that is a higher punishment, which is that of murder. That's why we have monitoring system, that if this is a murder, we do not allow you to go to certain places, and we have a tracking system of where murders are as compared to little or minute levels or offenses of theft. That's what we want to do. On the first level, that's why we want to elevate the status, because of this, how the state will actually react to that problem at the end of the day. With the issue is actually put into an elevation of status, which is that of a crime against humanity or a criminal punishment. It's more likely for states to actually look upon the issue and actually target that issue extensively and not just be lenient, because it is actually a big issue to be handled upon. But on the second level, we believe if we talk about individuals and the mentality they get when you if you elevate the status, it's the mentality of the customers is that they really question themselves at the end of the day, because the crime isn't just about me having sex as a civil punishment, but it's now a moral dilemma for me, or even something more like a deterrence for me, because I know this is a grave punishment. It's not something to be taken at a leniency for. We believe at the end of the day, this is also what leads to trends, not just the state as an external body, but on the internal body of the people, to actually have trends in terms of solving the problem and actually viewing the problem. When there's a massive or greater impact, when the label is not just civil punishment or random punishments at the end, but it is a criminal offense at the end of the day and a crime against humanity. We believe when you compare both sides, it's only on our side we get the benefits of all these other things. When you have trends that actually help people develop and help solve the root of the problem, and at the end of the day, we believe the motion shall stand.
A mislabeling of a crime does not mean that a crime is equatable to something that is capital punishment. And when you think that, oh, it's okay to label just having sex with maybe a consensual prostitute as someone who is raping, then we can also label theft as murdering your property and is tantamount to a capital punishment. We think there needs to be some standard of proportionality and some understanding of what rape is. And we cannot trivialize Because when you trivialize rape as an idea that might be consensual, you also trivialize all the other rape victims out there and also the onset of the law after that. We do not want to do this, and we want to stand against that. There are two things I'll be talking to you about today. One, how you change the narrative of rape in two levels. One, towards individuals themselves who have gone through that. But two, towards prostitutes and how you make them look like the victim themselves. And this forces and change the narratives of society to show that, yeah, these people are actually doing it. They're not actually people who are complicit in the act. We think we need to stop that. But before I move into those, let's look at a few rebuttals, right? One, on the idea of prostitution as manufactured consent and whether or not it's rape. On the first level idea, no, we don't think so. Right? We think there are many outsets of you to step out of prostitution itself. You can go to report the police and receive reduced sentence and even receive welfare benefits that could help you. And by the way, welfare benefits would have been given to you anyway, right? We don't think that you could have been resorted to doing an illegal act to continue getting more money. But secondly, on the idea of consensuality and pimps, right? Maybe even if it was forced by a pimp, we told you that they can always report out, so to step out of that narrative, right? We think that there's less punishment already in status quo when prostitutes themselves say that, yes, I'm a prostitute, I want to opt out of the system, please punish my pimp for that, right? But, okay, let's look at the last one. What's the balance of rights? And this is something that you need to understand. They assume that they're just going to protect every prostitute out there by labeling them as rape. Right? But look, what happens now is they're actually punishing people, they're actually punishing people who commit the act even further, right? We think that these people who are already doing that might be already the worst of the worst, right? Where probably that they go to prostitutes even after all the checks and balances out there, right? Where they are going to go to jail, by the way, where they are going to get that on the public record, and they probably lose jobs for that. But what's the idea of proportionality in this sense, and why there needs to be a balance? When you do this and label this as rape, you're effectively saying that this prostitute this person forced himself on that prostitute, right? Which didn't actually happen. You are allowing a leeway for a lot of people or consensual prostitutes out there to say that, yeah, this person, was complicit in the act. I didn't have any problems at all. So you allow that to happen. You do not decrease prostitution, and that was what they were trying to fight for, right? But you also change the narrative towards rape victims, right? Where you essentially say that, yeah, you are basically might be a prostitute. You are basically parallel towards a prostitute in this instance, right? We don't think that it's a good thing in the law or even in society's perception itself to change that narrative, right? Where rape is something so tantamount and so harmful where you yourself force yourself on towards that person and that person tried to fight against you but couldn't say anything or didn't do anything, right? We think that is rape we don't want to change, right? But let's also look at another idea about creating this greater level of discourse and mentality, right? We think that, okay, this will be integrated into my speech, but firstly, let's look at a few simple rebuttals, right? We think that mentality is harmful in itself. Right? Why do we need to understand that there needs to be some form of understanding why mentalities need to stay the same or change, right? It should only change when the act is so harmful upon itself. But they need to prove and understand that, they need to understand that this is a blanket policy that will apply to everyone, right? And not only just people and minorities like prostitutes under pins, but also consensual prostitutes. And I will balance that out under my speech in itself. So, but before I move on, I need your eyes. No, okay. Let's look into this idea and why we need to balance out both the punishment and proportionality. Look, what happens right now is that when you change this narrative and essentially tell people on the ground that yes, if you do have sex with a prostitute, you are raping that person. So let's look at the first stakeholder in this debate, how individuals who have gone through rape themselves. We think that when people who have gone through rape themselves see this and say that you are being parallel to a prostitute who could have the chance of opting out, we think that you are essentially telling these people that you are trivializing the act that was done upon them that was so harmful in itself, right? Well, hello, I was like these three men forced themselves onto me and I was trying to fight back and I couldn't do it and that is rape in itself. Right? But the thing about prostitution, there are multiple ways that prostitutes themselves could have not gone into it and could have fought back. We tell you that the levels of punishment in themselves will be decreased. We think that we already told you that about welfare, but not only that. Look, you don't necessarily have to step into prostitution as an easy way out. We need to understand that we also need to have some form of deterrence for other people to step into the prostitution ring in itself, right? If you label them as victims, you essentially tell everyone else out there that, yeah, maybe what they're doing isn't so bad. They're not actually criminals and complicit in their act. They're actually just there and they're willing to serve a demand, and the people who are committing the act are criminals themselves. You need to ensure that both sides of the coin have that form of deterrence, right? Not only the people who commit the act, but the people who might go into the act as well. So what happens now is that, sure, there might be some form of benefit. Like some people might look at it and say, oh yeah, maybe it's more harm. But the problem is now that more likelihood that when people look at it now and say that, yeah, this person is not really the victim, so does she really deserve any punishment or deserve the harm? And this reduces the deterrence, right? And that means that whenever you see a report in the newspaper about prostitution and that person being labeled as a victim, you don't necessarily see, oh, I'll take you, yeah. Look, okay, it's not a good deterrence because if you are labeled as a victim, you lose all form of legitimacy. All form of connection with that crime in itself. You're not labeled as the person who was complicit in that crime, guys. You're labeled as the person who that crime was committed onto upon yourself, and you had no guilt in that act in itself. But the problem is there is some form of guilt, right? Where especially, okay, let's move in the second analysis, and this will balance out very nicely. There is some form of guilt when prostitutes do it themselves. Especially when, okay, look, what happens now is that the balance is this. When you do this, when government does this, is that people now look at prostitutes and don't feel that they're guilty. Why is this problematic? Because you allow a loophole in the system itself, saying that, yeah, if you're a prostitute, we absolve you of all your guilt, and you can continue doing that. Right? There's no form of deterrence out there saying that, yeah, prostitution is a bad thing, you shouldn't step into it in the first place. So obviously, right, which side wins this debate is the side that proves and reduces prostitution and not allow those loopholes, right? We think side opposition closes those loopholes and punishes both sides, both sides anyway, and we think that form of deterrence out there is justified. We cannot equate this to rape.
Based on urgency alone, government already takes this debate, right? Because let's look at what both sides are trying to protect. What their side is trying to protect are already proven criminals. And what they want to do is to simply lessen the punishment of these criminals. We don't think that that's as urgent as protecting people who are actually oppressed, prostitutes who are actually forced into things that they haven't done, right? And the fact that they're saying that this is such a big punishment actually works for us. Because if it's such a big punishment, people won't even do this in the first place, and that's why we're tackling the greater problem in society. But I want to look at two issues and solidify our win. The first issue is the question, is prostitution parallel to conditions that quantify rape? And second one is, where do we best fight prostitution? Let's go to the first one. Because their main idea was basically, this punishment is something that's not proportionate to customers. Then the first thing they said was that there is consent when it comes to prostitution. And I have three levels of response to this. Because we defined to you from the very beginning that rape exists, and it is rape when there is no consent. So all the government has to do is say that there is no consent in this situation, or that the consent was something that's manufactured or done without proper mental capability, and we can already say that this is rape, and your punishments do deserve the punishments given to rape. Here's the first level. We already conceded to the fact that human trafficking exists, that really bad pimps exist in status quo, and these things are very much concrete cases where there is absolutely no consent at all. Because who would ever want to be, human trafficked? No one has ever consented to being human trafficked and sent into brothels. We think that these are very basic cases of lack of consent, and we already told you this is something that happens in a majority. Like in places like Thailand, where people children are forced into human trafficking, or even in places where it is legal, the majority of the cases, these are people who are human trafficked as well. That's the very basic example of having no consent, and it never engaged us in that model. But secondly, even if there is some form of consent, we've already told you that we need to question the genuineness of this consent in the first place. Because they were completely unresponsive to the context when we've told you that people are only forced to do these things because of poverty. Like even if I said that I was willing to do this, maybe I was only willing to do this because I wanted that money so much in order that I can feed my family back home. They never engaged this context because we think that if any person was richer, if any person lived in a better place, we don't think that that person would ever want to be a prostitute and would become a slave to someone else, right? Because in the end, even if this was some form of consent, that was only caused by the situation, something that was caused by things that they cannot control. And we don't think that we can accept that as a very legitimate form of consent, right? And thirdly, we think that we need to tackle this idea when they said that this was an agreement between two people, that the man actually talked to that person and realized that that person had consent. We think that this is very unrealistic, because when will you ever hear of a man who will talk to the woman before and say, do you have consent, right? We think that we are talking about consumers who are hungry for sex and are just willing to pay for sex just for the sake of sex, and we don't think that they would ever want a personal connection or would ever ask for the consent of this prostitute. All that consumer knows is that this person is viable and I'm going to buy this person regardless of the situation. But secondly, we think that I want to tackle this idea of proportionality, right? When they said that this isn't tantamount to rape. The thing is, this is tantamount to rape because it is rape, because it fits directly into the definition of what rape is, right? Because they never really provided any standards or any definition of what rape is, or why prostitution simply isn't equal to rape even if there's no consent. The thing is, there is no consent. That's the definition of rape, and we want to put that in, we want to give the same level of punishment. And that's why we think that it's perfectly equal and it's perfectly proportional. But let's look at this idea of trivializing the idea of rape, right? The first level is that this is extremely illogical, right? Because we think that more cases of rape does not mean that the evil of rape is any less than it is now, right? The quantity does not ever diminish the gravity of a crime. Whether or not it's one murder or whether or not it's multiple murders, that murder will still be a murder, and that murder is something that will still be condemned no matter what. So we think this is a illogical fallacy. But the second level is this, right? When he said that now women who get raped will be called prostitutes because now prostitutes are punished in the same way as rapists is an extremely big leap as well, right? Because we think that people can perfectly distinguish the difference of a woman who went to a brothel and a woman who is simply just raped in a bar or whatever. It's perfectly logical for us to assume that people can do that, and we don't think that women are just going to be called prostitutes just because they were raped. But before I go on.
So, if the newspapers are going to say that, yes, this person was raped by a man, it doesn't matter if they are prostitute or not, we're going to label that person as a victim. And resolve all guilt. Like, we're not deterring the act of prostitution at all.
That leads me perfectly to my second case, right? On where do we best fight prostitution? And let's focus on that first, right? On putting a label of victims, right? And here's the first thing. How is that a wrong thing? Because that's exactly what we wanted from the very beginning. We wanted to remove the punishments, or like we wanted to extremely lessen the punishment given to these prostitutes, because they are victims. They are victims of their conditions. They're victims of poverty, and they're victims of human trafficking. And that's what we want people to hear, right? Because right now, prostitutes are stigmatized. Prostitutes are discriminated and called sluts, and are called promiscuous because they're not victims. They're people who chose to sell their body. What we want is sympathy from the public and actually know that these are victims who are only forced into this job because of their situation. But here's the second idea. When it comes to fighting prostitution, this is actually a good thing. Because when you label a prostitute as a victim and not as someone who gets a lot of money out of it, that's how you deter prostitution. Because now people are going to think that I don't want to be a victim, so why would I ever want to be a prostitute? That's the message that we want to give to you. And that argument actually perfectly works for us. But let's go to the second idea, on this idea that there are already enough punishment in status quo. That's very problematic, because when I raised the POI, he said that we only punish individuals when that prostitute went to the court and say that I did not have consent. Here's the problem. That's never going to happen, because if I go to the court and say that I did not have consent, I'm going to be exposed as a prostitute, and even if you lessen the punishment, that's still punishment, and who would ever want to be punished? So in the end, most people, if not everyone, of all the consumers will simply escape the punishments that are currently in place in status quo, whatever it is they're trying to have. We feel that in the end, they never really gave us a robust model that tries to solve the problem of prostitution. They just stayed with status quo, and status quo clearly isn't effective. What we told you is that we're attacking the demand. We're stopping people from demanding prostitution so that supply won't exist as well. That's something that was unresponded throughout the debate. For all of these reasons, because we fight prostitution at its core, and because we think that prostitution does fit the qualifications of rape, I am very proud to propose as Ateneo 1. Thank you.
that side of the house need to understand one thing. Even though prostitutes are in a situation that can be trivialized, so can the customers of that prostitute. We don't think it's necessarily fair for them to set up in a case where it's always the prostitutes who are necessarily the victim in this situation. Because we told you time and time again that the customers of those situations could also be the one trivialized. But we also think that status quo and the situation on the ground is fair when we let the prostitutes get away with the situation they face in. Even though they are lawbreakers within the country that illegalized prostitute, we let them get away because we understand the situation. But under our paradigm, we also think it's fair when status quo already punish individuals who engage in those kind of means, even though it's illegal. We think it's fair enough because we label them as lawbreakers. We put it in their social status. It's harder for them to get jobs. We think that's enough of deterrence within the situation. 3 issues to be debated. Number 1, regardless of the environment that the prostitutes are in, we don't think you solve the problem anyways. But secondly, we also think that the second issue, the individuals who actually face actual rape, then the harms accrue to them, and thirdly, the disproportionate punishment to the customers itself. First issue, well, the idea of human trafficking. We already told you time and time again, we don't think this is actually true because we think that the human trafficking usually happens in countries where it's legalized, because if it's illegal, it's much easier for you to catch the pain, for you to catch those individuals. But secondly, even if it's true, we think that the assisting help towards the situation is assisting help towards the prostitute is not enough because you still allow pimps to get away with the crime. You don't tackle the problem at its root. But also, we think that you stray away from the state's ability to then catch those pimps in that situation because you always want to focus on the customers. And also, secondly, on the idea of deterrence, how you take away the demand. Then you have to understand one thing. We think that within status quo, you put people in jail, they get really high fines, and you label them as lawbreakers, and it's going into their social status. Which means that the problem is those individuals and those minority of individuals who still engage with that situation, even though it's illegal, that means they were willing to take those chances within their social status. Which means that the deterrence that you put upon them as rapists won't necessarily work upon them because they were still able to risk those situations, which means that you labeling them as rapists, you won't deter the problem. Anyways, but fourthly, we also think that those individuals the government targets are individuals who will necessarily not be affected at all because they are able to then allow themselves to be labeled. Anyways, we don't think you solve the problem. But fourthly, we also think that individuals on the outside who also are at most of the time are in the scenarios where it's trivialized, which means those circumstances they talked about the prostitutes can also happen with the customers because at that moment in time it's deemed consensual. The environment they were in is extremely hard for us to delineate and hard for us to actually determine, which means that the blanket of consent that exists for those customers put those customers in a situation of unfairness when you only look upon the crimes that happen towards the victims, towards the prostitute who we don't actually think should deserve that leverage, right? But we also think that the situation of the customers can also be trivialized, which means they were able to, they're necessarily lured into that situation and it was deemed okay, it was deemed consensual. We don't think it's fair for you to necessarily deem them as rapists because they were in the exact same trivialized situation those prostitutes were in. But secondly, on the idea of poverty, which is not necessarily substantiated by that, but we decided how to understand the situation. But we think that being a prostitute, we still think that they made an active choice to take that option out, right? Because there are check and balances in the system that could help them come up with poverty. There's a social welfare that exists. But those individuals still choose to make the active choice to be a prostitute. And we have to understand what the choices are to be a prostitute. It is not easy sit down because you allow yourself to be objectified by many individuals. So and making that choice necessarily we think that when you stray away from other choices such as low-paying jobs or necessarily becoming a beggar, but you chose to be objectified, which means in some scenario you consented to be allowing yourself to be objectified. It's okay for you to be objectified by other human beings. We think that active choice still exists, even though you're in a situation of poverty. But thirdly, we also think you don't solve the problem because you make the state stray away from the actual root of the situation. You don't target the root of the problem. We already proved to you deterrence doesn't exist. But even if deterrence exists, it's also harmful because you allow for the pimps that they talked about to just stray away from the state and move the girls away. So we don't think if you make the state not focus on the actual root of the problem and you allow them to get away with it anyway. But the second issue on how the individuals who actually face rape and the harms accrue to them, we have to understand the individuals who are actually raped. These are individuals who are paramount to a lot, who have faced paramount of harm. There's a lot of significance put upon rape now within status quo. But how do they trivialize it? Because the state labels prostitutes as also victims of rapists, and they label people who engage in those situations as rapists. So secondly, you allow prostitutes who who necessarily were not forced like how rape victims were forced to be individuals who are deemed the same pedestal within the individuals who actually got raped, who actually had people rip off their clothes, who actually had people objectify them to the maximum. But thirdly, we also think that you put rape victims putting on the same pedestal, and the state takes that active stance that these individuals are also rape victims. So you push those individuals who actually were raped into a side, and you deem them less significant in this scenario. But the second problem is these prostitutes are also individuals who broke the law. But understand that status quo protects those individuals because of the arbitrary situation that can happen. But at the same time, because those prostitutes are deemed as lawbreakers, you then put victims of actual rape also placed in the same pedestal as them, that they're deemed as also lawbreakers in a certain sense. Because now they deem themselves as tantamount to be a prostitute who chose an active stance to break the law. But secondly, labeling them as lawbreakers is better to deter. Because they question us, why can't we label these prostitutes as victims? We can deter them better. No, we think that when you label them as lawbreakers, it's much more easier to let them stray away from being a prostitute. Because if you always put them on the side of being victims, that's when you legitimize their acts, and that's even more harmful. One of the third issue on how is disproportionate punishment to the customers. Number one, we already pointed out the check and balances within the system that happens because they're deemed as lawbreakers. It goes to their social status. It's harder for them to get jobs. It's harder for them to legitimize by other people on ground. We think that's enough because not only do the prostitution situation is trivialized, but so is the customers. But secondly, it's harmful because it's not the same tantamount towards what actual rape is. Because when you look at the situation, it could have been immensely coerced as well. Because under their principle, if consent didn't necessarily exist for the customers, we also then allow them to get away with it. Because their idea was so long as so-called consent don't exist, you let people get away with it. But consent can also not exist for the customers, but we still protect them anyways. Thirdly, how it's not fair to put them as the same pedestal as individuals who actually had malicious intent. Because individuals who actually go out with malicious intent to rape other individuals, we don't think that's a situation that the customers actually face. Because what the customers thought is that it's deemed consensual, and they found a prostitute who was willing to engage with them, who lured them in, and we don't think it's fair for you to label them, but especially when the situation is so hard for us to delineate, it's so hard for us to prove. For all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
There will be three reasons why side opposition wins today's debate. Because we definitely proved to you who reduces prostitution even more. We also told you and proved to you very, very accurately, and they didn't respond to, by the way, that there will be public uproar and there will be a change of narrative of that rape itself. Okay, so let's go into the first idea, and this is probably the biggest one, because this is what side government set out to prove, that they probably protect and reduce the prostitution right now. The problem is, right now the deterrence exists on both sides of the coin. And we think that only the people who really want to go to prostitutes are people who are the most radical and most extreme and are not rational, because they already disregarded all the forms of checks and balances already out there. Right? But secondly, how is this bad? Because right now the comparison is this. They are labeling prostitutes as victims, right? And they didn't respond to this idea as well, because they said that, oh, sympathy was a good thing, and that's what they wanted it to be. But the problem is that with sympathy also comes absolution of a lot of things, right? Absolution of guilt and absolution of the liability that you paid towards doing the act complicitly, right? We already told you from the start that yes, we probably think that maybe some prostitutes were in a dire situation. But they could have done so many other things to set out the dire situation and not resort to the forms of illegal activities that they did. We still punish people who steal, even though they were in abject poor, right? But we still try to help them after that. We think that we need to set a deterrence and form of stance, saying that, yes, we understand that you probably have a lot of things that you need to do. But the problem is now that we also need to deter all the other people out there from understanding and realizing that maybe the act is legitimate, right? We tell you that essentially when you allow sympathy to happen, you also say that yes, a lot of people you can now go out and do this, and you increase the form of liabilities out there. Right? You increase the amount of people who think that going into prostitution is a good thing, right? I think that's extremely harmful. We took that clash. But secondly, let's look at public uproar, and this is something that is extremely big. Because from the start, Kenneth already told you why public uproar was so important. Because with public uproar also comes the disregardation of the values that the state sets out to believe. If you actively say that yes, prostitution is rape, but disregarding all the other people out there who were raped, who had no chance to say no at all. And this essentially sets off a public outroar, right? But essentially people don't feel that this labeling is proportionate, or people don't even feel like this thing is fair to all the other people out there who have gone through actual rape, right? The failure to realize this is what government exactly did. Because when people have public outroar, they don't necessarily want to adhere to state's values in itself. When this happens, essentially exactly what Kenneth told you, is that people will look at this and say that, yeah, this is not actually true, we don't want to believe in it, and this is harmful, especially when you need to understand that you, on the government side, need to uphold a standard, right? And when people don't believe in that standard, you essentially lose out on all the policy, on all the benefits that your policy tries to implement in as well. But lastly, let's look about the narrative of rape and why you change it and why it's harmful, right? Essentially, we told you from the start, and we told you throughout all our speeches, right, that rape needs to have a narrative that you cannot step out of it. That not only are you implicitly coerced, which is what government tried to do, right? Which we already told you from the start, was not a valid reason, because we told you time and time again, there were so many ways that you could step out of that position, right? But the narrative rape needs to be when you as a person or you as an individual was forced into doing it with physical force, right? And you could not say, no, I don't want to do it, and no, I don't have a choice to do it, right? But that's the problem under status quo. When you equalize both of these statuses to prostitutes itself, where they could have said no, you essentially equalize that standard, right? We think this is extremely harmful, and we told you why. Essentially, you're disregarding all the possibilities of actual rape victims themselves, and their families, and all the emotions that they have gone through themselves. You're essentially saying that, yeah, what you've gone through isn't actually what is, right? You're essentially parallel towards a prostitute. We don't think rape victims are prostitutes, guys, and we do not want to stand for side government.
Can I start? To conclude this debate, 3 points of summary coming from government reply. Firstly, I'm going to look at the stances that each side has. Secondly, I'm going to look at the state's obligation in this context. And thirdly, where can we best solve the problem of prostitution, which is the 50% of the debate they completely missed out. Let's go firstly onto the stances. We heard a dangerous concession come from leader of opposition that they're willing to actually put massive amounts of punishment onto the consumer as well. And there's a sudden shift in direction for the opposition whip that on one hand, in her intro, she told us that some of these consumers can get trivialized, but at the same time they said there's sufficient deterrence to punish these people anyway. We're extremely confused what values they're actually standing for, or whether they want to actually protect the consumer from any kind of harm, or whether or not they actually want to say that these people are sufficiently being deterred, or they agree to our idea, you should punish the consumer. We are extremely unclear with the stance that they had in this debate. But secondly, let's go to the second issue on the idea of the state obligation. The main question we heard from their side was that the prostitute gave consent, because actively she said, yes, I will have sex with you, right? There are three main points that we need to look at when it came to this argument, and three flaws of it. First of all, we asked ourselves the question on our side, did he or she actually consent? Because what we've done inside government is established you the consent. We told you that regardless of what scenario, we think that no consent was actually given. First of all, we told you that these people usually do get human trafficked and have no consent in that kind of scenario. But secondly, and this is a scenario they never actually engaged us upon, we've told you there is a propensity for manufactured consent or for people to not have the right mental capacity to make these decisions. Because in a context or environment of poverty, these people might not necessarily have the proper reasoning capacity to actually just go into prostitution. Most of these people are forced to do it because of their own poverty and because of the need of them to actually go into that area. In the exact same way as we told you that you punish people who do become alcoholics in a context of rape, we've told you that the exact same logic can apply in this scenario. But secondly, we also told you there is a massive contradiction with their stance in their case, because again, if they agree that the customer can be punished, then they are also going against the idea that the customer should get some more protection because they can get trivialized, right? But thirdly and finally, what we've also told you in our cases was that even in our worst case scenario where there might be some form of consent, we ask ourselves the question, how can you properly monitor whether or not consent would happen if you're especially when prostitution exists within brothels or within non-legitimate institutions? We've given you the important distinction between legal prostitution and illegal prostitution. We told you how more consent would be more likely on legal areas because of the fact that there is some form of regulation in this context. So why do we win this issue? Firstly, all of the harms that they asserted to us, the idea of social perception, or painting these women as the same as like victims of rape, putting them on the pedestal, relied on this huge assumption these women were complicit and they did give consent, they did do some harm when it came to the idea of prostitution, but they never actually gave us rigorous analysis to challenge what we've told you. Because from the start of this debate, we told you that is precisely what you want. You want these people to be painted as victims because we don't think there is actual blame to be placed onto them. We establish you the proper standards in this debate. But let's go to the second issue, on where can we best solve the problem of prostitution, the 50% they were extremely dismissive about, on the root of prostitution itself. The only root they asserted was the idea, well, pimps are the root of the prostitution, right? First of all, that was a dangerous concession because they agreed that human trafficking overrides consent people, which is what we're talking about as well. But secondly, the key fact that allows prostitution, which they ignored, was the lack of punishment towards the consumers and the huge demand these consumers get when it comes to having prostitution. And thirdly and finally, they simply didn't listen to our prop because we told you that we will punish like brothels as well. So why do we win this issue? Because on their side, they never actually proven to you the effectiveness of their policy, and they never properly mechanized as to how their policy would even work to begin with. We've pressed you on, comparatively pressed you on how the current status quo is simply not enough because you're not punishing the very demands, the demands and the very consumers of prostitution. Our government even told you that realistically, you can't expect a prostitute to go into court because of the fact that she will simply be put into punishment. She will simply get her job out of the way. Comparatively, our primary deputy prime minister have told you how you properly target the consumers and how you properly target the crime of the idea of prostitution by elevating this very status quo, by creating sufficient deterrences to the consumers. Ladies and gentlemen, if you truly want to solve the problem of prostitution, if you truly want to protect people from the idea of rape, stand beside government. Thank you.
Thanks.